Hi, and thank you for having me. My name is Dr. Joanna Tai, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at CRADLE, the Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. So today I'll be talking to you about assessment for inclusion, promoting equity and valuing diversity in higher education. I'd first like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands from where I'm giving this presentation, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I thank them for their care of the land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that education and learning has been something that has been happening here for many, many thousands of years. And I hope that it is something that we are continuing today. On the right of the slide, you'll see Bunjil, who's one of the creator spirits in their creation stories. And you'll also see a map of Victoria, that's the state in which Melbourne is. And you'll note that there's a range of different territories or areas marked out, and that represents just some of the different groups of Indigenous people who live here in Australia, in Victoria. So that's a little bit of history and background of where I am at the moment. I'd also like to acknowledge colleagues at CRADLE and also the support from the National Centre of Student Equity in Higher Education, NESHE, for their research grant in 2020, and also for Deakin University supporting a Students as Partners project on inclusive assessment. And those projects contribute to some of the things I'm talking about today. So this is a bit of a different format of the presentation. So firstly, there's this recorded presentation, and I have re-recorded the first couple of minutes because I made some mistakes. And then we'll come to the interesting part where I actually get to talk to you in person. So for this first part of the talk, I'll be outlining the context of inclusive assessment in higher education. I'll tell you a little bit about student experiences in assessment and why it's important to think about assessment for inclusion. And then I'll outline some of the things that we've tried in designing assessment for inclusion and what this means for future assessment design. And then I'll provide a little bit of a summary around directions for future practice and research. So we'll start with the Australian context, where I am.
We've been fortunate for a number of years, I think 20 to 30 years, of having some very rough and very sort of instrumental data collection, which focuses on a number of particular equity groups, which I guess you could sort of say there are objective sort of things like where people live and have come from, and what socioeconomic status that postcode might be classified as. Also things like students with a disability or students who grew up in a non-English speaking household. And so all that data means that I can present to you this graph today, which demonstrates that over the past 25 years or so, that equity groups in higher education have been increasing as a proportion of people studying within education, but also that the number of students overall enrolling in higher education in Australia is also increasing. And so you can see that some of these groups, for instance, students with a disability, that sort of teal large dotted line has a little bit more of a steeper trajectory than some of the other groups, such as students from a low socioeconomic status background, which is the pink little dotted line closer to the top of the screen, or for instance, women in non-traditional areas looks a little bit more flat. There are also students from remote or regional areas, so living far away from major cities, and Indigenous students, and students from a non-English speaking background represented on that graph. And all of this is to say that yes, we have seen a significant increase in numbers of students in higher education, and also as a proportion, we are likely to see more students with various characteristics from different equity groups represented in the cohorts of students that we interact with on a day-to-day basis. And while we do have these big buckets and labels that we can put on students that the government collects data about, enrolment data and completion data, these are background characteristics that we're talking about in terms of diversity. But we can also think about different students learning goals and interests and why they are here studying education in higher education. And we can also think about the diversity of what they plan to go on to do beyond university. Why are people studying in higher education? And so those are just a few ways to think about diversity, but it is a thing that is increasingly something that we need to be aware of. And because the government collects such good data, we know that though enrolments have increased, there are still unequal outcomes for different student groups. So again, here are Australian domestic student completion rates, and this is after 9 years. So that accounts for part-time students. And you can see on the graph that the total of national domestic student completion rates is sitting somewhere between 70 and 80%, possibly just under 75. But that for particular groups, so in this case on this graph, those from a low socioeconomic status background, remote and regional students, Indigenous students, and also external students, so those who are studying off campus, they all enjoy a lower rate of completion compared to the standard student. And what this suggests is that there are different outcomes. Students enjoy different levels of success, and we contend that assessment impacts on this student's success. And why is this? Well, assessment is incredibly influential. You need to pass your assessments in order to get the degree. And my boss, David Bowd, put this as students can, with difficulty, escape from the effects of poor teaching, but they cannot, by definition, if they want to graduate, escape the effects of poor assessment. So that's what we're focusing on today, the assessment. And you might also be thinking about this in a little bit of a more sort of micro way. John Biggs talked about the backwash effect. So all the things that happen as a result of assessment in terms of learning, in terms of student outcomes that were perhaps less intentional. And we can also think about this through the way in which we are required to make adjustments and accommodations for particular groups of students, i.e. those with disabilities. And that might mean that students are closer to getting the right mark for what they are capable of. But Jan MacArthur also argues that our responsibility in assessment is more than just making sure students get the right mark. We also need to think about what happens to learning and what happens in the student's experience. And we can continue to talk about the problems with assessment. So I mentioned adjustments and accommodations for students with disability. Unfortunately, we have known for quite some time that adjustments don't actually fully meet student needs. So things like extra time in exams doesn't manage everyone's condition perfectly. And on top of that, we can only provide adjustments or accommodations to students who declare that they have a disability or that there is a reason that they might need special consideration. But more recent work by Susan Grimes and colleagues has demonstrated that students don't actually want to declare their diversity to everyone. They don't perhaps see that necessary in some circumstances. They don't think that there might be an impact, or they're embarrassed, or they feel shame, or they think it might not be fair to other students themselves. And so again, Jan MacArthur makes some arguments around this, thinking only about that procedural fairness around what happens with accommodations and adjustments for particular students means that we don't actually think about, well, what are we doing in assessment? We just let the assessment go on as it is. But we also ignore how students experience accommodations and assessment, and we also ignore what happens to students and how they learn. So you might be thinking then, well, your talk was maybe about inclusive assessment, or is it assessment for inclusion? And these are not new ideas. So Christine Hockings in 2010 provided a guide and defined inclusive assessment as design and use of fair and effective assessment methods and practices that enable all students to demonstrate to their full potential what they know, understand, and can do. And so this perhaps was a more procedural, a more design-focused approach to assessment, looking at what happens to the assessment more recently, we've been thinking harder about what happens to the students and what assessment means for the students. And so in our book, we talk about assessment for inclusion, which should recognise diversity in student learning and endeavour to ensure that no student is discriminated against by virtue of features other than their ability to meet appropriate standards. So we're shifting to the people involved in the assessment rather than the assessment task itself. So you've heard a little bit about the statistics and a little bit of a conceptual argument for why we should be thinking about assessment for inclusion. I'd like to now share with you some student experiences in assessment, which hopefully convinces you further that it is an important thing to think about. So the first thing we did, of course, was to conduct a literature review. And we wanted to know what are the effects or outcomes of inclusive assessment for students. And this paper has been published. And we conducted the literature review with systematic methods. We focused on recent literature because we thought that there have been quite a number of changes to the way that higher education research, teaching is done, teaching and learning happens. And we managed to identify 12 studies that were published between 2015 and 2020. And these studies involve students with disabilities, so they had medical conditions or learning things like dyslexia. There were also students studying an additional language. And the focus of these studies in terms of what they did included providing students with assessment choices, looking at implementing UDL, so Universal Design for Learning principles for assessment, varying educator practice in relation to assessment, allowing translanguaging in assessment, which is where students are able to use more than one language in a text, and also actually looked at group project settings and how diverse students, in this case, I think again around culture and language, were distributed across those groups. And what they found there, what we found across all of those studies was that choice in assessment was valued, but students were still uncomfortable with disclosing their disability. Now, we were also really interested to find out what types of outcomes were reported. And firstly, there wasn't actually that much about the outcomes in terms of assessment and performance, but we did find across some papers that the variety in assessment, including choice, improved students' confidence and reduced their anxiety. So firstly, a good thing, especially in relation to assessment. And secondly, only one study conducted by Geraldine O'Neill and colleagues found that there was no impact of assessment choice on marks, and students performed better than previous cohorts who had taken the same unit, but also they performed better compared to the university average. So there is a little bit of evidence suggesting that choice in assessment and making things more inclusive is good for students. I found that that wasn't really enough, though, to go on. And so I thought it was time to actually ask some students themselves, what about assessments contribute to inclusion? So these were student narrative interviews, and we invited students to participate across 2 universities and ended up doing 40 interviews. The response and the interest in the project was so great. We actually asked a bunch of students to respond in writing, and 11 students did that because we didn't have the capability to interview them all. We accessed these people and invited them via the institution's accessibility service. And so while they did have a reason for an access plan or special consideration, which probably was related to some kind of medical condition or disability or something else like that, we do also have students who are professional athletes who access that service to manage the competing nature of demands on their time. And in addition to this, we also ask students their personal circumstances in relation to where they lived, if they were first in family to attend university, or if they came from a low socioeconomic status background. And there was a mix of that across the students who participated. And so you can see that there is overlap in terms of diversity. We can't just assess them on one particular form of diversity. And so in this paper, again published, we looked at the social and material arrangements that impacted on inclusivity of high stakes timed assessments, essentially exams. And so The paper goes into far more detail, but if I can summarize very briefly, firstly, connections between people. So positive relationships with faculty and support staff were really important for students in relation to assessment and feeling like they were included. Secondly, technology was mostly helpful, but not always. So, and this project happened during COVID. So things like internet connection and the speed were a big consideration in terms of whether students felt that they could actually participate in some types of exams and some types of assessment. But also things like screen readers were incompatible with online exam platforms, or just being able to use a spell checker in particular platforms. The spaces and timing of exams were also important for students with physical disabilities or medical conditions. So for instance, having to front up at 8 a.m. for an exam felt incredibly not inclusive for a student who had fatigue in the mornings due to medication. But being able to choose when she started her exam in an online COVID setting was actually felt really inclusive for her. Task requirements, so memory recall, also had implications for those with fatigue and learning differences. So there's a little bit of a hint there about what we might do to design assessment for inclusion. But let's take it a little bit further. I actually wanted to know from students themselves what about assessments could be more inclusive. And so we ran some discussion groups with students as part of this Students as Partners project. And so there's a methodological paper there led by my colleague Molly about how we involve student partners in this research. We did have 5 student partners and 52 student participants who participated in 6 collab discussion groups. And we wanted to know, how do diverse students experience assessment and what strategies could improve the inclusivity of assessment? And so we found, firstly, as part of one of the icebreaker activities, we asked them, what words come to mind when you talk about your feelings and experience of assessment? And you'll see on the right-hand side in that graphic, that word cloud, that anxious, stressed, and frustrated were the 3 most common things that came out for them. And in terms of what they suggested to make assessment more inclusive, firstly, that it should accurately reflect capabilities that are relevant to work, whether now or in the future. That opportunities for learning through formative feedback as part of assessment tasks was really important, so that students would understand how they could improve and how they were going. They also identified that across the different places and sources of information about assessment, that instructions were not always clear and consistent, and that criteria could be better explained, and that these things would help all students, understand what was required of them in assessment. They also pointed out that due dates and times should support all students to complete the task. So for instance, someone who had carer or work responsibilities was unlikely to be able to have the same opportunity to do a task and submit it at, say, 2 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon if they had to be on shift or they were looking after a child. And so they might lose a whole day's worth of time to work on that assessment due to that time frame. They also outlined some broader things around resourcing that we hadn't really considered before. So access to the library for resources to complete assessment successfully, or how students were able to attend and complete placements and their requirements that could form part of their assessment. Another way to find out more about how we should design assessment for inclusion was to actually get people together in a room and see what they would do differently. And we did this across 2 rounds of participatory workshops. The first was as part of that NESHE grant, and we ran it at 2 universities with 2 units of study at each. And the second round, we ran just at 1 university. But across both of these rounds of workshops, we involved the unit chairs, so the people responsible for the assessment design, and student partners and others who had involvement and a stake within the assessment. And the first round focused on exams, but the second was more broadly focused on assessment experiences overall. So here are a few things that happened as part of those workshops. In round one, we looked specifically at exams. So firstly, there was redistributing assessment content across assignments and the final exam, so students would have more than one opportunity to demonstrate their learning and particular learning objectives. We also reconfigured an OSCE. So that's like a clinical examination for practical examination for those in health professions to improve the use of reading and preparation time. And that really reduced managed anxiety for a whole range of students. But also the staff felt more relaxed. We redesigned exam questions to suit the length of the time students had to respond. So thinking really carefully about the situation of the assessment. And then finally, we implemented opportunities for formative assessment and feedback much earlier in the unit so that by the time students came to that final exam, they felt more prepared and supported. In round two, when we focused more broadly about assessment design and not just about exams, we came across a broader range of things that could support students in an inclusive way. Firstly, a video screencast assessment walkthrough, which clarified requirements and criteria for all students. Then for unfamiliar or new assessment formats, so where students might not have encountered a particular type of assessment before, another unit chair commissioned exemplars, so students would actually see what it's like without having all those worries around academic integrity or people plagiarizing because this was not actually another student's work that was submitted. We also scaffolded and had those progressive assignments with proportional weighting to ensure that students were appropriately supported and built up to the final task. And another really important thing one unit chair did was to represent diverse people within the assessment task. So to focus more broadly about what types of futures students might be thinking about in studying that particular unit. And so across all of these different attempts to change assessment, we have learnt a few things. Firstly, that identifying improvements to assessment design is relatively easy and students can offer simple but impactful ideas. But changing assessment can be significantly challenging, and this can be due to attitudes of staff and students. So even if we change the assessment in one iteration, someone might change it back again. University policy, especially around submitting changes and significant changes to assessment design. There's been a lot of discussion around the impacts on accreditation and certification for courses that have that external focus, and also the resources required to enact change. And so in the projects that we ran, we did have additional resourcing to support development of resources, exemplars, which not everyone has, and how to make that sustainable. So in summary, it's not just about specific equity groups. The problems that we encountered across the projects with poor assessment design seem to be amplified for all diverse students. In doing this work, we've been shifting away from that deficit discourse, thinking about students that are somehow less. Rather, we need to consider how students can demonstrate their strengths and capabilities in various ways. This is important not just for inclusion, but also to ensure that our assessment is valid, that the assessment actually ensures that all students can demonstrate capability. And finally, when we're thinking about those modifications, we did target specific groups. But in targeting a specific group, we realized that they are also likely to support many diverse students. And this aligns very well with universal design for learning principles. So where to next? What are the future directions? Well, firstly, we'd like to remind everyone that designing assessment for inclusion is an ongoing process. It involves many stakeholders and it happens at multiple levels, from task design to thinking about assessment conditions, interactions across the university and how students experience those at the policy level. So it's not something that we can just tick off a list. But we do have some suggestions for strategies for inclusive assessment design, and I'll try and go through these very briefly in the next few slides, but they are also in that paper. So firstly, talking about authenticity in assessment. And we can think about authenticity to self, so how students see themselves, their values, their future aspirations. We might also think about how authenticity is represented in the task. This might be about acceptable support say spell checker, using a computer, but we might also think about restrictions. Does someone actually have a dictionary around? Do they have reference books or sources, or will they be required to recall something really quickly? We can also think about the authenticity of our values and how they are represented in assessment. And this might include involving diverse students in the assessment design process or in feedback around assessments so that we can improve and refine what we do. The next is about programmatic assessment. And this is really taking that program level perspective on required learning outcomes and thinking that not actually everything has to be assessed at every occasion for us to be sure that someone across a whole program has achieved those learning outcomes. So you might need to think how tasks are linked or related, how each particular task contributes something about a learning outcome to our overall picture or understanding of student capabilities. And also to think about this over time. So can we scaffold students' capabilities from first year into second year into third year and not expect of them to have that third year capability when they're undertaking a first year unit? Finally, we can think about assessment for distinctiveness. We're not expecting cookie cutter graduates, really. We're expecting that graduates should be, in some way, prepared to adapt to their unique destinations where they go on to in work, whatever they're doing. And so here we might be thinking about assessment strategies that use open-ended tasks. This can support students to develop their distinct capabilities, to work on their strengths and develop their weaknesses, but also offering a variety of ways to demonstrate learning and distinctive learning also aligns with universal design for learning. Of course, there are still a whole range of questions that need to be answered, and here are just a few that I can think of off the top of my head. We still don't know how different assessment strategies impact diverse students. We don't know exactly how we can design assessment that is inclusive for large cohorts, which could be very diverse. We also don't really know about policy and how that influences the implementation of assessment for inclusion. And something finally that I think is really important, how can education leaders support inclusion in assessment and beyond assessment as well? So my key takeaway messages are pretty simple in the end. Firstly, that student diversity exists across many dimensions, so we have to consider all those dimensions. Secondly, that assessment is really important in higher education. It is something that contributes to students' learning, but it is also important in our jobs for certification for being able to say that, yes, our students can do these things when they leave the university. And my final message is that assessment for inclusion is everybody's business. And so we all have a part to play in making assessment inclusive for all students. So thanks very much for your attention. Here's a reference list. We will share the slides, so don't worry too much about that. And just to share a few resources, the QR code is the same as that link for CRADLE, which has all of our publications, including some more practical resources, the CRADLE Suggest series, and also to mention that our book, Assessment for Inclusion in Higher Education, is open access, so everybody can access that. So thanks again for your attention, and I look forward to discussing with you very soon.